Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start out by firstly saying that I feel I need to apologize for only speaking today. This has been due to the fact that we had to change arrangements due to my schedule as director for the Democratic Governance Group in UNDP in New York. But in addition to that, we had a small hiccup around the visa. And I do want to here, in a small way, just, I suppose saying paying homage is a bit, it stresses it too much, but to thank the team, the group, for intervening. Because your intervention with the consul in New York resulted in a phone call from the consul himself apologizing for not accepting the passports at the time required and saying it was a huge mistake. He didn't know what happened. And yesterday morning they issued the visa, and hence I arrived in the early hours of this morning. I believe it's quite an honor to join you here today during this very, very important week of yours. And it's an honor and a humbling experience to, as an African, address you and join you in the Africa Awareness Initiative. And in many ways, and here I'd want to make a specific reference, the University of British Columbia has an opportunity to be a bit of a symbol of hope for what is possible to many youths through an initiative that is quite unique, and that's to play a supportive role to the concept, this concept of the Africa Awareness Initiative, and the idea, the move to create an African Studies major at UBC. I'm aware that it's being considered at a high level of the administration. I do know that there's a number of considerations before such a step is taken, and we know there's obvious considerations around how this particular major will be subscribed to. But I do just want to emphasize that this concept goes beyond the consideration of politics, self-interest, and so on. It is actually, it could contribute in a small way in what could be a broader wave of ensuring that there is a contribution in the future of Africa. So we are pleased that Mr. Brian Sullivan, the VP of Students, has taken a special interest to make this happen. And I thought I should isolate this today in particular, and I'll come back to this not directly, but indirectly at a later stage, as one would like to present a few other challenges. I have had the opportunity at 1 a.m. to meet with the president of the Africa Students Group here, and as well as with some of the other colleagues, VPs and others. And I do want to say, having engaged with her and with others since I've arrived, I definitely feel quite humbled as I attempt to raise a few issues here today, and I will be drawing on many as I do so. Now, before I go into that, I would like to talk a little bit about democratic governance, because as stated in the presentation of my CV, I am, at this point in time, the director of the democratic governance practice in the United Nations Development Programme. The practice itself, as well as the group, extends over 135 countries. We have 5 regional service centres. We have 3 on the African continent. We've got 1 regional service centre in Johannesburg. which covers southern and East Africa. We've got a second one in Dakar that covers West and Central Africa. And we have a third one in Cairo that covers the Arab states more broadly. And I think all of you are very conscious of two huge events or situations in what's in the UNDP's demarcation part of North Africa and the Arab states, what's happening there. The one, of course, is the Sudan, and the fact that we've just had the completion of a referendum in the Sudan where there's been an outcome for the creation of two countries that I believe will still form very much part of Africa. And that's, of course, the North, with its headquarters with its capital in Khartoum, and the South, with a capital in Juba. One of the largest countries in the African continent, with an incredibly rich history. A history that reflects on a history that makes a contribution to African civilization and global civilizations as well. Something that's not been spoken about enough, and I'm sure it's something that also captures your mind. And then secondly, the situation in Tunisia. The fact that we know, and let me be simplistic about it and make it a bit light, and of course, having all of you here, you'll go into the analysis. We've seen the power of a street vendor being able to tilt things, but it's not just the power of an individual. Very clearly, there's been incredible challenges around questions of inequality, democracy and access to democracy, and so on. But in terms of governance itself, we know that a general definition is that governance denotes a system of values, policies, and institutions by which societies manages its economic, political, and social affairs through interaction within and among the state, civil society, and the private sector. At the UNDP, we see governance and democracy not as a system practiced by any particular country or group of countries, but rather a set of principles and core values that allow people to gain power through participation while protecting them from arbitrary, unaccountable actions in their lives by governments, multinational corporations, and other forces. One can also go much into that, but I'll leave that to discussion time when we come back to it. What I'd want to raise before I depart from UNDP specific is that from a human development perspective, which is a perspective articulated by UNDP 20 years ago last year, but from a human development perspective, democratic governance contributes and can lead to people's human rights and fundamental freedoms being respected and allowing them to live with dignity. And processes and mechanisms based on democratic governance principles enable people to have a say in decisions that affect their lives. It enables them to hold decision makers accountable, and so it goes on. And it feeds into economic and social policies that are responsive to people's needs and aspirations, which aim at eradicating poverty and expanding the choices that all people have in their lives. Now, let me step back a little bit, and I will start out with a little bit of a personal story, and then continue that and lift various other issues that I believe is quite pertinent to us today. And I just want to start with a story that is very much located in the continent I'm from, the sub-region I'm from, and the country I'm from, Africa, South Africa, Southern Africa. And as I relate this, I'd also want to say that in Africa, we have never seen the development of the continent and our future in isolation of the rest of the globe. As a matter of fact, we would want to argue, and I know that there is further evidence coming to the fore, that in the country that I'm from is where the cradle of humankind is. This is where there is archaeological evidence to that end. And of course, being part of a broader globe and being part of humanity, we do see the linkages that are there, and that there are different centers. But we'd wish to say that the march of man in a gender, not man in the male sense, but man in the human sense, is let's envisage the march of man from the cradle of humankind that finds itself in Gauteng province in the Western Cape. We believe that against that background, it's also important to note that we do not see, as I said earlier, Africa as an island to itself, but as part of a broader whole. As we look, and going back to my country again, and think back of the struggle against apartheid, the struggle for democracy, the fight for freedom, which for some of us is not something that we simply heard about. We were part of that. That particular struggle was not a struggle of the South African people alone. It was a struggle with the peoples of the African continent. It was a struggle with the peoples of the world. And I would argue that the anti-apartheid struggle was one of the struggles that actually mobilized the largest, brought together the largest numbers of people across the world, supporting us in the struggle for freedom, in our struggle for liberation. And having said that, one would also want to say, and here I'd want to borrow from former President Thabo Mbeki, who said that it is important for Africa, he says so now, to claim the 21st century. And I quote, "The need for Africa to recapture the intellectual space, to redefine its future, and therefore the imperative to develop its intellectual capacity," close quotes. And I felt this important to highlight once again today as we gather here at UBC, and as you gather as a student body and beyond, because this is precisely why there is a need to ensure that you engage in initiatives that's going to ensure the vibrancy of that intellectual space. And I will develop that further. He also went further and reflected on what he called 6 steps to nurture and build Africa's intellectual cadre. And that is to rebuild and sustain our universities, and I quote here, and other centers of learning, to attract back to Africa the intelligentsia that has migrated to developed North America, and build strong links with intelligentsia in the African diaspora, and give space to these, the time and space they need to redetermine the future of Africans, close quotes. And he then went on to reflect on the reinvigoration of the African Renaissance. And he also speaks quite a bit about that, as with material goods, Africa is a primary producer of intellectual resources and also a consumer of intellectual products. But he indicates that it makes little contribution to the value that is added in between being the primary producer of the intellectual resources and the consumer of intellectual products. And again, it's a challenge I want to throw out to you, and I want to throw out to the group and say, so what are you going to do about it? It's not about the answers here today, but it's about the questions that should be raised and what can be done. Now, I had promised that I was going to take you on a little bit of a personal journey, and I meandered a bit, but that was part of the personal journey. And let me sketch the personal journey in a bit of a story. So, 1974, a 14-year-old young girl who at that particular point is in Standard 7 at high school, which I think is the equivalent of what is grade 2 here, if I'm correct. That's 2 years into high school after 7 years of basic education, so it's grade 2, is on a bus in Cape Town. And this bus moves across something like 7 kilometers. In the bus, the front 4 seats are reserved for whites only. And the rest of the bus, the seats in the bus, is what are for to be occupied by blacks. But this bus travels on a route where South Africans get on the bus. And of course, the back seats all fill up and the front seats are left vacant, are empty. And the adults and children stand on that bus all the way to its end destination and don't occupy those front seats, simply because the law says, and there's a sign up in the bus that says these 4 seats are vacant for whites only. And that 1974 is not too many years ago. Maybe some of you have not been born at that point in time, but it's not too far back in time. And one fine morning, this girl decides, no, but why should she stand every morning for whilst this bus travels about 10 kilometers and sits? And of course the bus driver says, you can't sit there, it's not allowed. And she says, but nobody's sitting here. Yes, but this is reserved for whites only. And she goes forward to say, but why should we conform? We don't want this separation. And after all, we believe in the equality of people. And this is a 14-year-old. And of course, the adults in the bus are grumbling because they're going to be late for school. For work. Besides her being late for school, they're going to be late for work. And the bus driver promptly stops and says, I'm going to lose my job if you continue sitting there, so you stand up. And she, who happens to be me, continues sitting. Well, I wasn't much taller then. I was a lot lighter. He simply got out of his seat, came around, physically lifted me out of the bus and left me on the side of the road. And I had a clip card, which you clip one way going and the one way coming back, and obviously couldn't get into another bus. And it was a bit of a long walk, not Mandela's long walk to freedom, it was just a long walk to school. And there I was standing there and said, yeah, Geraldine, this is for your being obstinate and wanting to make a point, not expecting to be put out of the bus. And no opposition from anyone else, because there were workers who wanted to get to work and others who wanted to get to school. Fortunately, I had an Afrikaans teacher, Mr. Jacobs, who at that point in time was courting his future wife. And she was living in that area, and he saw this figure, because I was in high school uniform, along the road. And he actually stopped and said to me, gosh, why are you standing along beside the road? And besides that, you look so angry. It's as though you've got flames in your eyes, get in. And I get in and relate the story of my incident on the bus. And it's just a small, minor incident, nothing in the broader scheme of South African politics. But that was a little bit of a nature of resisting, opposing, and asserting. I subsequently ran for the Student Representative Council, and major lesson, and this was a year later, I think that was actually 1975, 1976, at the time of the discussions, negotiations in Namibia, and when there was the whole Ditan Turnale initiative that took place. And I'm sorry if I'm boring you to death, but let me relate this anyway. So I'm running for president against a young student, male student who's in matric. And he, of course, makes a very rousing speech in his campaign speech on how we will improve access to recreational facilities, we'll have a better canteen, and so on and so on. And I come in and make a speech around détente in Namibia and around the issue of representation and that the people should determine who their leaders are. Guess who won? Russell Ali won. He won because he spoke about the issues that students wanted to know about. Long breaks, better canteen facilities, and here I was bothering about the problems across the border in Namibia that was then Southwest Africa, So the lesson for me at that point in time was package your messages right. And keep a pulse, keep your finger on the pulse. But what I didn't lose, and continued from that point to date, is don't lose the bigger picture. How do you ensure that you are able to get the student body to be interested in the bigger scheme of things? That we don't look at issues that only happens on campus or in school. And yes, it's great to have a better canteen. And we didn't really have a canteen. We had a tuck shop. So you can imagine, the little window in the wall type of thing. So you can imagine why he got traction and all that kind of thing. But it's actually looking at that kind of thing, looking at messaging and all. And okay, so Russell won, and I said, going to come back. We'll bounce back at a later point. This, and I didn't run for president thereafter. I thought, okay, leave that one. I'm not suggesting, Tatu, that I'm intending to run for president of South Africa in future, but the two of us can talk about it, I could either probably support your campaign, who knows, when you consider that in future. But these are seeds that were planted and seeds that grew, because I subsequently went into exile as a member of the African National Congress. I was and am a member, it's no longer, it's been demobilized, of Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the military wing of the ANC as well. And the rest is history. As indicated in in the brief CV that was read as well, that I had the great privilege of serving in the first democratic parliament of South Africa, and I was able to serve in 3 cabinets. So I served in the cabinet of former President Nelson Mandela and 2 successive cabinets of Thabo Mbeki, President Thabo Mbeki. I also was Deputy Elections Coordinator of the African National Congress's elections campaign for the first democratic election in 1994. Now, too many eyes. It's not just about the me. There was always a collective. And strong leadership is about a leadership collective. Individuals can serve as champions. Individuals may make a difference, but it's not the big I that makes the difference. It's the collective. And it's drawing on the collective base and ensuring that that base is rooted at all times. I think if there were various lessons as well, is never allow alienation of the leadership base from the broader membership. And this is whether it's the membership of the movement or party, as in the instance of the African National Congress, or movement away from the base if it's the student body, and ensuring that you have a connection to that base and draw on your base and ensure the advocacy that's required within that base to take things forward. And if anything, I want to say a thing, build on the youth leadership. Build, build, build. We need succession, and succession and leadership is earned. It's not something that you inherit. It's not something that comes to you through as a birthright. You've got to earn it. And leadership is not something you impose through fear, because the fear that may be there, or the reverence, you look anywhere in the world, fear is not able to win peoples. South African government and its military machine was a huge machine. Its impact on the frontline states in Southern Africa was devastating in instances. And this was seen through the raids, the occupation that was there of Namibia, then Southwest Africa, its incursions into southern Angola and a continuous and protracted war in southern Angola, what we saw happening in Mozambique, and the support in Mozambique of what was a protracted civil war as well, the incursions into other frontline states, but to mention a few, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and so on. It was there. But yet, the people of South Africa was very conscious that they were not going to live under a repressive regime. And hence, in 1995, at the Congress of the People, the Freedom Charter was drafted, was drawn up. And I want to share a bit about the process around the Freedom Charter for a few minutes. And what I'd like to say is the decision of the Freedom Charter was taken a year earlier, in 1954. And in 1954, again, the liberation movement and its various partners, and there were a number at that point in time, brought together a group of, actually called for volunteers. And there were 10,000 volunteers that went out to all corners of South Africa. Amongst the volunteers were outstanding leaders like Nelson Mandela and others. And they went to various corners of South Africa to find out, in the mines, on the farms, in the schools and all over, what is it that people would like to see the government of the country represent? What would they like to see as the fundamental values that would underpin South African society? And they gathered in Kliptown, thousands of people, at the Congress of the People. Kliptown is on the outskirts of Soweto, in the broader Johannesburg in Gauteng province. They came together in Kliptown. And those leaders who were banned stood at distances, and people stood on the roofs of houses and shacks to listen what was said. And when the leaders gathered, the preamble of the Freedom Charter started by saying, "We, the people of South Africa, would wish the country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. And there were 10 clauses in this Freedom Charter that talks about the right, freedom, the right to education, freedom from fear, the right to houses, security and comfort, and so on and so on. The reason I make this point is so that you can link this into my reference to democratic governance and where I am today. And to say that these values should not be seen as values that are there, that are these values that are simply in the UN Charter, but that we should bear in mind that what is in the UN Charter resonates very much in terms of the values that people truly believe in. Values people have fought for, values people were willing to die for, values people are still willing to die for. But we need to ensure that we take these values forward and make it a reality. And it brings me back to Africa claiming the 21st century. And when that reference is made to claiming the 21st century, is not claiming it to Africa as Africans, narrowly, but saying the 21st century is one where Africa needs to ensure that it should redefine its future in order that it is no longer marginalized, that it is no longer on the periphery, that we do not allow for Afro-pessimism to creep in, that we acknowledge that there are challenges and problems, but in acknowledging those problems we must find the solutions, because in finding solutions and in looking into the future, and as future leaders, you need to be optimistic. You must be positive. You need to find the answers and find the solutions. And I want to actually just take us back to 2 years ago, when August of 2009, I believe, in a meeting of the African heads of state and government in Tripoli in August, they stated, and I quote, that there is a need, they said, let me just quote the part that I've captured. Making and sustaining peace and security is also an intellectual challenge. We therefore undertake to build the capacity of our university and research institutions to explore the nature of African conflicts, to investigate what succeeds and what fails in conflict resolution efforts, and to arrive at African-centered solutions drawing from our own distinctive and unique experiences, close quotes. Now link that back to what I raised in the beginning. I mean, I'm drawing a reference that looks at conflicts, but I'm wanting to emphasize on the theme of intellectual capacity and the inputs that are required from that perspective. But go back to the point I made earlier, when I referred to a point that was made in the importance for Africa to claim the 21st century, when in the reference to the material goods of which Africa is a primary producer of intellectual resources and also a consumer of intellectual products, but make little contribution to the value that is added in between. And I think that call was made in Tripoli recently again, and the call is there as well. We also know that there is the new Partnership for Africa's Development that's been there since 2002. And it's in essence a framework for fulfilling Africa's promise for a brighter future. And this is a framework that was developed by African leaders. Now, having said that, I'd want to say that it is aspirational about reversing Africa's economic decline and to end its marginalization and to consolidate new political and economic systems of responsive and accountable governance. So it's aspirational in that respect. The expected outcome as well is to ensure high and sustainable economic growth, reductions in poverty and inequality, to look at the diversification of productive activities, to enhance international competitiveness and increased exports, and to ensure greater African integration. This is what's been clearly spelled out. There's been a program that's been developed, but the speed of implementation has not been at the pace required. And I think this is a particular challenge. So, it's not the governments that's going to make a difference, and probably some of you are saying, keeps on talking about these African leaders, and they're all government leaders, so where does it leave space? To ensure the turnaround, to make the claim that's required for the 21st century, to ensure that we are able to build on the input required from African intelligentsia and the intelligentsia in the broader diaspora, to be able to do this together by ensuring a correct analysis of African realities and the global context within which our continent exists and pursues its objectives. We need to come together across different sectors of society, not just about government. Civil society has a very critical and vibrant role, and one would see universities and intelligentsia and the youth in that particular sector, and of course the private sector. Everyone needs to come together and make that difference. It's not about spectators. We had the spectators we need with the World Cup last year. And that Football World Cup was a great one because it actually proved that those who felt that an African country couldn't do it, it proved that yes, we could do it. We could do it very well. What it may have made many wonder when you looked at those stadiums and beamed into those stadiums, you could have been anywhere in the world. But it was the African World Cup, that one. And for us as a country and for South Africa, it did amazing things. It helped us, and allow me to meander once again, it allowed us to build national cohesion. Every South African, irrespective of race, class, or gender, focused on that World Cup. I only went for the last 2 weeks, so I was there for the last 2 weeks physically. I wasn't there all the time, so I felt a little bit bad about it, but that's there. But watching, just following this in the media, and having Afrikaners, South Africans, face painted in the Ghana flag, was a revelation. Not even the South African flag, supporting the black stars of Ghana showed that we saw ourselves as Africans as well. Now for many, they'll poo-poo this and say it's not important. What was the value for the World Cup? For us, it was incredible. It helped us both with nation building and also the realization that we were part of Africa. And let me say this, and weren't we upset when that Black Stars goal was stopped by the guy who, we say cheated. And yes, we know, So we all cried, and then instead of us all supporting the next developing country team, what did we do? We went for the opposition. We said, we can't, you cheated us with Ghana. But I'm just reflecting on, that's where we need the spectators. And that's where we went along. And that's what helped us to build national cohesion, social cohesion. It made a difference. And I believe my daughter's in the area of telecoms now. She was a researcher in a consultancy firm at that point. She said they used to practice once a week. They'd have an hour off. All of them had to together in a group in the company. All the researchers were doing the Diski dance. Now, that kind of commitment was all in building up support. I can't do the Diski dance, but it was a dance that was done around the World Cup and so on. So you had everybody coming to support it. You had the private sector, you had civil society, you had everyone supporting around that cup. We need that kind of wave. to actually say, let's turn things around on the continent. Let's make NEPA the reality. And the intelligentsia, the young intellectuals, yourself, the universities, you need to make a contribution. And to the diaspora out there, now I'm part of the diaspora, I'm a migrant in the UNDP at this point. We need to look at how do we ensure that we make our contribution in a real sense. Because we're not going to bemoan what happens on the continent. We need to ensure that the mechanisms that have been put in place, and some of them that are very sound, that they actually work. That there is the drive for it to ensure the change that it should be. And we shouldn't step back and say, but we have fear, there's repression, there's this or that. Don't we allow those spaces to be occupied? Don't we as civil society or in civil society say, okay, we won't do that. We can't, at this particular point in time, make a contribution because it's going to be difficult and we fear this or that. We should never cede spaces. So you occupy the seat in the bus and you could be taken off the bus, but it doesn't mean you stop the struggle. And maybe it's time for me to stop. I see it's 1 o'clock and I've spoken too long. And I haven't even gone to, there was still the written speech, but we're not going to bother about that one. But I hope that some of these thoughts have helped. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
Great, thank you very, very much, Geraldine. You are definitely an inspiring woman and a great role model. I feel very proud to be South African right now. And I'm so glad that you so eloquently shared our history and your great knowledge of policy and even some of your personal stories. This conference week was Africa, a place of promise, and we've clearly seen Africa's role in the 21st century, as Geraldine mentioned, and how sort of we can all help to be part of this movement forward. And your stories and leadership can definitely be related to different sort of struggles that we move forward here with, even at UBC, with pushing the African Awareness Initiative. So we'll have a couple moments for questions. So if Geraldine, you don't mind coming back up and taking some of them, because I'm sure we all have many. I have one if you'd like.
Oh, you've got many. Okay, great. Okay, it's your chance now. And let's make it an interaction, because I wouldn't claim to have all wisdom, and I'm going to get you guys to feel some of the answers too. Yeah? Shall I start at the back and then I'll come down? Yeah?
Thank you very much for really this your talk. It's very, very interesting. Actually, I have one comment and a question. I'm going to start with the comments.
But you need to tell me who you are. You know who I am, and I don't know who you are.
My name is Mustafa. I'm from Dakar, Senegal.
Yeah.
And actually, when I was 10 years old, I was talking to my grandma about how to become a leader. Yeah. And then she told me that, okay, are you ready for this? I said, in her national language. Mm-hmm. If you want to be a leader, you have to be behind your people, in the middle of your people, and in front of your people at the same time. But as I reflect on that, she was right, because you really have to lead, but you have to step back to listen to your leading. But also you have to interact with your people. And that's what she called being a leader. Now, my question is, for example, as I look back to Africa, we have a lot of, presidents right now in Africa who may govern a country for 20 years, 25 years, 40 years, something like that. Do you think that we should start by really thinking about that leadership first in terms of how long the president should be in the country in order to build a strong leadership? Because I see that it's really a problem for many African leaders to just stay powerful for 20, 25 years. And then, do you think we should start with that first and then move on?
Thanks. Can we take a few questions and then we'll come back and have an engagement? I saw a second hand there and then I'll come down to you here. And I see none of the girls speaking.
Yeah, thank you, sir. My name is Yasin. I come from Burundi. I'm a student here in Political Science and International Relations. When you look at around here, all the entire Department of Anthropology think that it is what you call Africa in the global village. Think that it is a global village. Some people, they have coffee, drinking. Others, they are enjoying the music. Others, they are listening to talks. Others, they are outside sitting in the shade of trees. While others, we don't see them around. They didn't even attend, they didn't know what is going on. That is the global village. Where is Africa in that global village? And the second question, when you look at behind you, there is a paper written on Africa, and everyone here has a paper. That name, paper means that papyrus comes from a Greek, Egyptian word called papyrus. Papyrus, it is a plant in Egypt. Egypt is known as the origin, the pioneers of civilization, media and technology. Egypt created what we call literacy. They invented literacy, writing and reading. But today, the Club African Awareness, which invited you at UBC, they are struggling for African studies. Long way, as you said in Mandela Day and in Ghana. African studies are not seen in the global village as they're seen as less important. But I've given you an example. A UBC professor today cannot tell students that the science which you are using in writing and reading came from Egypt. They cannot teach that. What do you think about that? Thank you very much.
My name is Alton Wazira. I'm a UBC alumnus from Sri Lanka, so I'm not African, but I have enough African in my life. He's my roommate. I have two questions for you. We talk about this place a lot. Number one, what are your thoughts on W. Sanmoyo's ideas around aid? And I guess it sort of does tie into the work that the UN does, and I don't think she's necessarily the biggest fan of international agencies and the role that they play in Africa's history, or recent history at the very least. The second question is, what are your thoughts on young populist leaders like Julius Malema and the discourse that he creates in South Africa, and whether or not you think that's healthy for the society that's developing there? Thank you.
Hey, my name is Daniel. I'm from Tanzania. I have one question. It comes from a troubling feeling that I've had since I became, I don't know how to put it, but I came to the developed world. What's your view on the African diaspora in regard to the development of the continent? What do you think those who are not in the continent could do to help develop their own continent? Because we become kind of selfish once we step outside and we're not doing our own thing. What do you think should be done to help the African diaspora be an active part of the development of the continent?
I think we'll take this maybe one more here and then see.
Mine related actually, because I have traveled to Africa a number of times and I really love it. And I really want to make it part of my life. But I tend to feel that since I'm a Westerner, I don't necessarily feel like I ought to be taking a leadership role there. And I was wondering what kind of role you see someone like me from the West who wants to be part of the land of promise. What kind of role do you see for someone like that?
Maybe I should take some of that. Yes.
Pretty much the same question as hers, except I'm Asian rather than Western.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. Some are quite challenging, and maybe that's when the throwing back comes. Let me start with the first one. I think there's no question around this challenge of life presidents. I think, as I said earlier, leadership is something you need to earn. When you lead people, you also cannot assume that all and everything is embedded within you and you are the one that needs to continue. I mean, it's unlike traditional leadership, like chieftaincy, where unless the chief dies, there can't be any succession. But I think that to a large degree, or I believe, that it's also the peoples of a country that need to change that. Because even in the instances where you've had leaders there for 20 years, in West Africa for 40 years and all that, there have been elections. But there were challenges in the sense that it would be argued that some of these elections were seen as going through the motions. Now, this is where you need vibrant political parties. You also need vibrant intra-party democracy, because it's not just about opposition parties, but you also need vibrant intra-party democracy to ensure change within. And a part of it is also related to what has come up in one of the other questions, and that's about building future leaders, ensuring succession. Because for as long as someone says, well, the stability of this country is vested in me, you're not going to have the kind of change required in leadership. And I think no one can claim, and mind you, we had outstanding leaders on the continent. Kwame Nkrumah, we can think of Mwalume, Julius Nyerere, and so the list goes on. But I think that there was never an intention that leadership should be vested in any one particular person. But that's why there is the African peer review mechanism. And the peer review mechanism is essentially about governance. It looks at political governance, it looks at economic governance, looks at corporate governance, and socio-economic development. And under the political governance in particular, it looks at the kind of constitutions that are there, it looks at vibrancy of parties and all that. And in that is inherent the whole challenge of terms. Should there be terms for leaders? And I think there's a practice that started, and it's entrenched in quite a few of the African constitutions, that presidents should serve no more than 2 terms. We've seen instances where there were amendments to the constitution, Uganda. There were attempts in Nigeria, but in Nigeria the party turned that around, and even parliament. So again, the power is within the people. And I think we always need to ensure that there are vibrant spaces in civil society. We also need to ensure that that leadership is developed, not only political leadership that will become government leadership, but there needs to be leadership in all spheres of society. We do have leadership in religious sectors. We have leadership in civic organizations. And we need to make these vibrant centers. Because when you have strong leadership all over and you have vibrancy, then you can also balance and challenge what we see there. So yes, indeed, it is a problem. It's a problem that should be overcome, but that's why we need to ensure that the mechanisms that have been put in place are utilized, but we need to ensure the vibrancy in society as a whole. Now, Yassim, this issue of the way the global village looks now and how I deal with the guys drinking and sitting under trees and all that, and where's Africa in that global village, I think you guys need to do something about that. Yeah. because we need to ensure that we also stimulate interest that's going to ensure that people come to where we are. We need to ensure that they are keen to come and listen. And that's a way of mobilizing. Let me go back, and I use this example again. The struggle against apartheid. Not everybody was interested in that struggle in the beginning. It required advocacy, mobilization and all. And the marches that were there and the waves that brought various people, and generational. You can ask anyone in North America, Europe or whatever. They cut their teeth on anti-apartheid struggles in many instances. It was the whole anti-Vietnam movement in parts of North America, and there was also the anti-apartheid struggle, you know, and many people tell me that, and they're a little older than me as well, you know, having engaged in that. But they needed to be convinced, they needed to be persuaded, they needed to be wooed, and they were ready to march and go out in marches where it could very easily have been said, but it's not your struggle, what on earth are you doing there? But they owned it because of the values that they were committed to, the belief in equality and so on. So let's build a vibrancy around this particular group. Let's develop the interest, and people actually going to say, if they're not invited, why am I not invited? Why am I not there? So we need to create that vibrancy. And I think that one needs to already applaud the association for what has been done to date, you know, because something is happening. Now, unfortunately, you have a speaker who comes 2 days later. Really, what can you do? You know, you're going to have a problem around that. But it's ensuring that you do have particular initiatives at times that's going to take it forward and put the issues on the table. And remember, the issues are not about doing for, but doing with. We need to ensure that we have support. We don't want anyone to do it for us. We have the disabled movement in South Africa, who says, disabled people's movement, they say nothing about us without us. So this is what it's about, and I hope that this also answers the last two questions. And I don't like this term Westerner. It's a little of a problematic term. It's also coming in and saying, I'm going to work with. I think where there's a challenge and a pushback is when people assume that someone comes in and assumes that they have all the wisdom and knowledge and are going to do and tell and whatever. When you're ready to come in, you're going to work in communities, with communities, nobody's going to push you back, because you become part of a community. And they'll say, well, we see you as one of us, you know. But for as long as you come in there and seem to be talking down, it's a different issue. Now, when we look at what has come out of Africa, do we talk about it enough? And I think we need to raise it even higher. And you've just had me signing your petition today on the struggle for African studies. So I've also been convinced to join that particular struggle now. So I think that was a comment around seeing what started, because, I mean, it's not only Egypt. Even if you go to Mali and you think about Timbuktu, and you look at the astronomers, astrologers, the mathematicians, and now there is a center that's been set up that's captured the scrolls of that time, that's really advanced beyond its time. There's so much, but the issue is what happened in between. And how are we going to cover the gap? Because we don't just want to celebrate what has been. We want to build on what's been there and where we've lost. And yes, not for today, but we know there's reasons that there's been the gap and the hollowing out. How are we going to ensure that leap? And it's your guys' responsibility to contribute to the thinking to make it happen. Now, Asram, did Tato tell you to ask me about Julius Malema?
No.
You should have asked him to tell you about Julius Malema. Look, we're not in a society with this freedom of speech. You're not going to close off anyone. But if young men like Tato and young women, South African women that are here, allows Julius Malema to be the only voice, then they need to answer why they're doing that. Because there's nothing that stops them to be in the youth movement and to engage and to say there's different voices. That it's not just about consumerism, that it's not just about craziness. And sometimes he says interesting things, but where are the other voices of the youth? So guys, you come out there, and there's a number of others. You need to see that you don't create. Nature allows for no vacuum, and you take that space. So not just about what I think, it's these guys, and nobody's going to feel sorry for them because they're able to intervene. So come out there, you know. There's an open space, and if you want one guy to occupy that space, it's not as simple as all that, it's more complex. But I'm saying South Africa has been known to have a vibrant civil society. Its youth leagues have always been vibrant, but there's space to engage and don't allow for a monopoly by anyone. And you're capable. What are my thoughts? I think Dambisa has come out with a very interesting thesis. And you've had a year, she's spoken about that thesis and so on. I would say that I wouldn't go for an either-or scenario. I think indeed there is, and if you look at NEPAD looks at how we should ensure the galvanization of domestic resources, capital, etc. But there's one thing, I think we need to have a combination of trade and aid. It's not simply looking at one or the other. And I don't think that there's any self-respecting leader in any sector of society that says that the total dependence on international, on aid is the route to go. That's not what any people want. But you also need, as in the instance of the Marshall Plan post-World War II, you also need a push to take things forward. With a clear plan, with the investment of resources, we need to ensure that we also galvanize domestic revenue along with aid to take things forward. But we also need to ensure that we put in place accountability systems, that there is not the siphoning of much needed domestic resources out of the country. And again, go to the constitutional principles of the Union, look at the African peer review mechanism, there's provision for it there. Let's ensure that we have strong cadres, both in government, civil society, and the private sector, to facilitate the turnaround required, with accountability and transparency required in society. So what should the African diaspora do? I've taken a cop-out route on this one, where I actually spoke here and said, I again quoted Mbeki, where he said, build strong links with the intelligentsia in the African diaspora and give space to these and the time they need to determine the future of Africans, but they need to do it with. And when one looks at that, we should bear in mind, and I hadn't followed this in recent years, but there was a global diaspora meeting that was arranged. And I must just say I missed that. And the major focus on that was to look at how there would be the galvanization of Africans in the diaspora to ensure that they they're able to plow back into and onto the continent. And I think it's a matter that you should look at, and it's something that we can also look at together to see how we take that forward. So let's look at that a bit more and make that happen, and also ensure that the institutions that must be put in place to contribute and drive towards this is put in place. And I think we have no means space to do that. And I trust that I've answered to all your questions. And before we lose any more people, say thank you very much once again. Tato, you want to come in?
No, I just wanted to ask maybe, I think for many of us here, we probably first person the link to the iconized individuals contributed a lot to Africa as a whole, former President Nelson Mandela. And I was wondering whether you could sort of share with us a memorable engagement that you've had with Nelson Mandela and why
There are many. Okay, let me take you back to 12th of December last year. 12th of December, I went to see him. Whenever I go back home, I go and see him. He's a special person, a special... many of us didn't only see him as a father, but as the grand old man. I think we're really privileged as a country to have a leader like Nelson Mandela. And I went to see him, and he's getting much older now. He's getting frail, and I think we all need to respect his time with his family. But I said to him, every time I come around to see you, and it's just to touch base and say what is there you can say. Previous occasion, I took the group of practice leaders from the various service centers to meet him, and I said to him, I want you to tell them how you see governance as important. So that's just about recent. Going back in time, there's so much to say, but one thing I'd want to remember, all of us see him as a great leader, which he is. But what many forget is he can also be very impatient. When he's made up his mind, he's made up his mind. Now, one gesture that we all know, and we know this is it, conversation is closed, is when in a discussion or in cabinet, he puts his big hands down. You know, when he puts sort of drops it on the, and you know, okay, now he's going to pronounce. And you hope that all your wise advice and your contributions will be considered in what comes out. But he's decided this must be done, and that's it. But I think what we also remember is his magnanimity. And he's one of the few people who has served 27 years in prison, comes out from Robben Island, and works in government, and in his security entail has both those who were part of the former South African Police Service, that's now, of course, integrated into the current, and those members who were in Umkhonto we Sizwe, who trained in police services and form part of one. What would I remember about him is he always has time to ask about your family. Always, and he remembers them by name, you know, and somebody who knows so many people, I mean, you wouldn't expect them to do that. What else can I say about him? Difficult debates in cabinet, and there were many. He's able to steer it. Let me go back much earlier in time to a difficult moment, and I think the two of you will also remember this. On the 9th of April 1993, Khrizani was assassinated, and it brought our country to a brink. And there was a meeting of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party's leadership Central Committee, as well as the COSATU, the Congress of Trade Unions. It was actually the Working Committee of COSATU, and the Politburo of the Communist Party was in that meeting. And it was on what must be done. And that was the decision. A decision was taken that he must address the nation. And the then president of South Africa was F.W. de Klerk. But it was not de Klerk that could go on TV to call for calm. It was Nelson Mandela, and that was one of the great moments for us. Because outside of South Africa, I don't think it would have been imaginable what that would have done. We had the fear that that could have completely resulted in civil war in South Africa. But with thanks to his leadership and the collective that was in place at the time, and it was collective leadership, we set a date for elections, which was the 27th of April 1994. We looked at ensuring that the negotiations, that there would be settlement in that period in the immediate future, so the negotiations were fast-tracked. And he didn't play brinkmanship with that. And there was the possibility to play brinkmanship at that point, and it didn't happen. And I think that's a big lesson. So I'm not making it too personal, but I think it was personal for us as a nation. Last example, I think many of us, was when he did when he took his oath of office as President of the Republic. And we saw the Air Force fly over. I think for many of us, it brought tears to our eyes. That was really a pinnacle. And those tears, I don't think, were shed in South Africa alone. It was across the world. A little bit like what happened just across the border. When, and Barack Obama is not a legend as Mandela is, but when Barack Obama took office, I think everyone watched as well, globally. But the difference was this one, when our icon, a global icon, took the oath of office. That was really, we said, yes, there is a difference. But that difference is not through the actions. It's not through the Constitution. It's not through law. You need to make the change practically, because a Constitution doesn't eliminate racism. Laws don't eliminate racism. It's generations that must make that change. And we're still walking that path, and the younger generation have to walk that path, and the beautiful ones who are yet to be born. And in a similar way, there's a challenge to the peoples of the world to make the change, as Gandhi says. We need to be the change we want to see. We need to live that change. We need to make it happen. And it's difficult. And it's easy to be cynical and say, I'm not going to do it. You know, why should I? It's much better to just have my own life on my own. We've got to make that difference, because we owe it to those who came before us. And we owe it to those who are yet to be born. So thank you very much for this afternoon. It was really wonderful being here.